calling on the Honorable Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay. When you run out of marble, sand, or rocks in your country, you can't just make new ones. Two main frames coming from government. One on how economical dependent, how does economies dependent on primary resource exports looks like. This looks like countries that built their economies in exporting these resources, meaning throughout the years they've already specialized in these spaces. So for us, that they have already done significant investments in getting technologies and resources to get this resource. And so for us, they have already maximized because of the dependency of the primary dependence this extraction that the extraction of these resources has made, meaning in the vast majority of the national revenue comes from the export of this. The way that you develop them here coming from opposition is very limited, i.e. on agriculture you're constrained by land and seasons or other non-renewable resources like coal. Insofar, these are resources that are pretty low in supply and it's going to end up running out in the vast majority of instances. This is why you need to pivot and create better opportunities for your countries to actually stabilize your economy for better future for a better future if you want to sustain these states, right? Meaning it's unclear what development of these countries will it's unclear what the development of these countries are likely to take, because insofar that we already have to consider that being dependent on this has already been a considerable amount of investment pushed into this. But secondly, on the idea of like scarcity of resource, it is bad primarily because if these countries continuously rely on this resource, you eventually run out. Panel, we don't have infinite things. This brings us to the problem of the resource curse. The country then spends so much to maximize the use of, like, for example, rocks, marble, etc. The moment that you deplete this, you can't keep the market going because of the lack of diversity in the market, insofar that this is what the dependency does. So far, the moment that these resources actually runs out, there's no safety net, and you're likely to have a falling economy insofar that you're not likely to invest on other things other than the export of these finite resources. This is important and true because at reality these resources will deplete so far as with like, I don't know, like 2 decades of like a continuous practice or like primary dependency on this, it will run out at some point. This is why we need to consider on there's a need and urgency to pivot into something that would diversify our market in so much that you want to guarantee a stable condition for these states in the next few years. Now, it's just a burden of where the economy is better to survive moving forward in the long term on how these states are likely to run. Why is manufacturing necessary then? Insofar that in the manufacturing cycle, what we have to consider that products are not done in one place only. This looks like having multiple supply chains, insofar, for example, in creating jeans wherein cotton is harvested in the provinces of, I don't know, the Philippines, then spinning it to fabric happens in India, and like dyeing it happens in Bangladesh, while sewing is done in America, right? In a lot of aspects of the supply chain there's a lot of aspects in the supply chain of the supply chain in manufacturing, in so much it's pretty easy for you to insert yourselves in a lot of these things, meaning there's a lot of room to enter and many processes in the chain that is urgent, insofar that there's a growing demand for more supply of goods, so far that there's an increase of demand in this, meaning right now, meaning that there's an ability to enter the market and make out profit out of these things as a new player, meaning there's better opportunity and less barrier of entry. How would this happen? Why would this happen? Well, this probably looks like a really, really gradual transition insofar that you want to squeeze as much as you can from these primary exports to begin with. But this also looks like heavily investing, like heavily investing on manufacturing, on the manufacturing sector, like securing contracts, looking what you can manufacture and what you can contribute to the supply chain, like building factories and hiring workers. The trade-off is you spend less on primary sector, but this is good. But this is okay because because then this is already done by private sectors in so much as state fund them less, insofar that this brings me to my second reason on the economies of scale, insofar that because of the previous years that you've already been dependent on this, what the pivot does then, you have less incentive to actually there's not much burden for you to reallocate these resources that you've already put into this, because you're already at the economies of scale in so much you don't need as much input of money to keep it functional, in so far that the private sectors that these states are cooperating with the extraction of these resources to keep this thing afloat are likely to still but are still likely to sustain this in the vast majority of instances, meaning the transition the most important things to consider is the transition where the manufacturing sector would be heavily active by the time that you already the main important consideration then is to have a functioning and a strong manufacturing sector the moment that you are already running out of these primary resources in the long term. What's the impact then, and why is this going to be successful? Note that there's a growing demand for continuous supply of already made goods. This is prevalent in the way that we buy things from online like Shopee, etc., etc. And so far, this proves the reason on why the supply chain right now in the global economy is quite strong. Insofar, inside manufacturing, there's going to be, for example, multiple ideas of, for example, like sustainable practices like recycling, etc., etc. Insofar that the inflow of supply are more likely to be stable than the primary sector. Insofar that there's a lot more opportunities in this, meaning in the future but then again, in the future, products are likely to be much more complex. Insofar that there's going to require other processes and new specializations in the intermediate. Meaning then or more likely inventions are getting much more sophisticated and require more assembly and intermediate processing that you want to apply and what you want to consider the moment that you actually go into these manufacturing spaces. But this is likely because development in AI is very fast, or more incentive to have more green processing. So far that there's a more urgent demand for a lot of processes that makes this possible, meaning the likelihood for actually profiting in this is very much likely, and the idea that the moment that you actually up in the comparative opposition that you want to continue exhausting these resources without diversifying your economy is much more harder for the people that's going to be affected by this.
Thank you for that fine speech, Prime Minister. Now to open the case of opposition, let's have leader of the opposition. Here, here.
Hi, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Wait lang po. Okay, I'm back. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I would like to contest the frame coming from Prime Minister because they did not necessarily take into account what does these private sectors actually look like, even though Prime Minister is correct that these private sectors have the economy on which they have been reinvested, therefore they're more likely to be known in this type of field. The problem is they don't necessarily have the budget, or they don't necessarily have the manpower nor the machinery in order to manufacture. So what do the private sectors actually look like? This looks like sea with their mining materials, or this actually looks like Philippines with agriculture and fishery. So what this means is that most of these economies are in developing countries, because it's only in these developing countries, especially within sea, that they have the most private sector, because they have the most raw materials at the end of the day. So therefore, they are reliant on the exports from these rich materials because sea is full of it, and therefore these developed countries also rely on sea to make sure that that they have to keep reinvesting for the sake of profit, but also for the sake of making sure that these materials at the end of the day has been used. But also secondly, why then is reinvesting much better compared to manufacturing? Two things. Firstly, manufacturing is really expensive, especially for developing countries, because firstly, the state does not necessarily have the capacity to do it, even if they do have the incentive to actually manufacture this because of the demand, but also because of the rise of AI. The problem with this is the fact that these states in general are most definitely might be corrupt, or most definitely they don't necessarily have the budget to do so, because we're still in a developing country, or we're still developing to the point that we cannot necessarily have good machinery in order to manufacture this compared to developed countries, which they have more budget, they have more manpower to do so. But also the problem with this is the fact that inflation is on the rise, and therefore there's literally a bad economy that's happening right now in status quo. So therefore, even if the state does have the capacity to some extent, they won't necessarily have the incentive to do this because of the fact that they don't want to necessarily ruin the safety net at the end of the day. So therefore, in the long term, reinvesting is much better because you can't is much better because you don't necessarily risk the safety net coming from manufacturing. You don't necessarily risk this compared to manufacturing, considering that manufacturing needs a lot of maintenance and needs a lot of money in order to maintain it. Even if Prime Minister tells you, oh well, we're just going to transition this at the end of the day. The problem with transitioning is the fact that not only do they have the machinery nor manpower to do so, they can't necessarily find anybody that's willing to help these developing countries, because these developing countries are the main source of private sectors at the end of the day. So therefore, Prime Minister or government in general has to prove why manufacturing, while transitioning, might have the incentive or might have the capacity to do this, even if they don't necessarily have the budget to do so. So a bit of responses before I go to my argument. Firstly, even if manufacturing can be the savior of these economies, especially towards developing countries, since there's literally a crisis ongoing right now, especially with demand and supply, the problem with this is the fact that the state focuses on different factors, such as politics, or such as there might have a controversy because, like for example, in the Philippines, there's flood control projects that isn't necessarily have justified at the end of the day. The problem with this is the fact that the state does not necessarily want to focus much on the economy, because of the fact that we have internal problems right now that's happening right now in status quo. Even if you don't necessarily believe that, the problem with this manufacturing is because of the fact that necessarily at the end of the day the economy is still quite stable, but the problem with this is the fact that it's only through reinvesting that you can't necessarily risk the safety net compared to manufacturing. So therefore, it's not necessarily worth it to gamble it if it's risky when the manufacturing market is not aligned with necessarily what you want, because considerably that these developing countries are still new to manufacturing because they don't necessarily have the machinery and the manpower to do so. But also, for my argument, it's only with reinvesting do you actually save your economy, and do you actually not fail your market value at the end of the day. So what's the premise towards all of this? Two things. It's because towards high inflation and bad market value. It's because the good thing about these developing countries is the fact that they are rich in materials. Even if there's a lot of demand, at the end of the day, these developing countries will make sure that they have their profit incentivized. So at the end of the day, they will still try to make sure that these materials are not necessarily going to go into scarcity at the end of the day. But also secondly, since these developing countries, especially Southeast Asia, doesn't necessarily have the budget to do so because they lack manpower nor machinery, and they cannot necessarily get international help from these developed countries, because they can look at status quo. There's literally an ongoing war right now. So how do we solve this? Firstly, in terms of the lack of diversity in the market, which Prime Minister posits to you, we solve this by reinvesting, because reinvesting only means that you actually get to diverse with other people. It's only through reinvesting do countries want these specific materials, especially towards developed countries. But also secondly, we solve this by not manufacturing it, because you actually lose these materials even if you try to transition it, even if you try to transition this at the end of the day, because as you transition, you lose more materials at the end of the day, and you lose more budget, and you lose more money and budget. You cannot create a profit because the lack of the incentives of the state. The incentive of the state here is simple. It's to be in the safety net because they don't necessarily want the market to fail. So what's the exclusivity towards this, right? So the exclusivity is that in response towards the higher demand, just higher. It sounds wrong, but in order to solve the increase of demand, just increase the prices. Even if necessarily these developed countries don't want that, they have no choice, because in order to save the raw materials, they need to comply with the developing countries in order to make sure that, oh no, we are going into a scarcity right now. This might seem bad, but it's the only way you don't actually risk the money. So in the long term, you still get profit, and you still get profit on which you don't necessarily risk it with manufacturing. This is important because this actually responds most of the material that came from Prime Minister, especially with the ongoing rise of AI. But the problem with the ongoing rise of AI is that the fact that these developing countries doesn't necessarily have the money in order to use AI at the end of the day, especially since these developing countries are still developing. It's only with reinvesting that you actually get to save more money, that you actually get to save the economy of these developing countries. With that, proud.
Thank you for that fine speech, Leader of the Opposition. Now to rebuild the case of the government, let's have Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Yeah. Just raise up UI. The first thing that I want to respond to is this idea of just increasing prices in order to supplement a lot of the necessities when these resources eventually become scarce in the future. The problem with this is that obviously it's just very difficult to justify a lot of purchases when you increase prices, and that is why in economic theory, when prices increase, demand also falls. So it's unclear why you will be met with the same demand, given that a lot of these goods are likely to be inelastic, primarily because when products become more expensive, the market moves to find alternatives, and that is why it's difficult to justify purchasing those same products as well when those prices have risen. E.g., this looks like how in energy, when prices of oil and natural gas, for instance, become a lot more unstable due to things like wars, but also because of things like resource depletion. Countries like China have moved to significantly invest in a lot of renewables, such as solar, for instance. And that is why that's also now at this point has become quite a dominant player in the way that energy is supplied and is generated. The next thing that I want to respond to is this idea of how you don't have the money to make this investment. The first response to this is simply that the state does this. These are the people who have revenue streams. I want to note, obviously, you take the money from the resource like that you generate, that you buy, that you get from exports to jumpstart your ability to manufacture. E.g., you build factories, you buy machines using the money that you gain from it. If it is enough to fund the entire economy, it will reasonably be enough to fund an entire manufacturing sector. What Rance explains is that the trade-off on the resource extraction and exporting is okay, primarily because these are at this point economies of scale that require less inputs to operate, primarily also because the resources themselves are becoming less, and that is why there's less necessity to also fund significantly, because there's just less ability for you to extract more from it. But the problem that Rance explains is clear, and this is the second response to it. Resources run out eventually, and no amount of new investment can restore things like oil or materials. No amount of new investment can generate you more arable land, because maybe it is just the case that the rest of your land is made of coal and not soil. They will have to pivot eventually in the future because these things will run out. That is a fact that they have to take, and that's a trade-off that they have to explain will be done well in the future. But if they do this in the future, they pivot in the future, there's just two big problems. The first is there's no revenue stream at this point to fund the pivot to another sector in the economy, because the main sector of your economy that gives you the most amount of money at this point where they would have to pivot is gone already because you don't have oil anymore, you don't have minerals anymore. It becomes difficult to plant things like bananas because the soil is just eroded at this point. But secondly, it is more difficult to enter at that point in manufacturing or any other sector because at that point where you focus more on your resources, other countries would have made the investment to diversify their economies. That is why they make the opportunity cost and they get the jump ahead of you. And that is why it's more difficult to make that investment in the future because it has simply become far more competitive because the others made the move that you were hesitant to do. Next thing that I want to talk about, what are the investments that they can actually do in the primary resource? I want to note that OO doesn't really do a lot of legwork to explain why this more investment is necessary. Because what they assume is that if you invest more in the resource that is currently being exported, then it is the case that you would get more of it and you're able to export a lot of it. But this ignores a lot of the facts that Rance was able to explain, which is simply that a lot of these things are depleting at the moment, especially because at this point in time, you have already extracted a lot of these resources at this point. So the two investments that are likely to do are the following. The first is it's likely to have better technology, but the problem is that these countries are likely already to be leaders in this industry specifically, and that's why they've already made the investment in the good technology that would allow them to make their operations more efficient. This is just because resource-based economies are incentivized to maximize their resource already. That is why at this point of the debate, where investments would have been made already and they're already heavily reliant on this product, it's unclear what more new technology you can make to invest in a lot of these sectors such that they would be far significantly better. The debate is obviously about our next steps at this point in time when we're already specializing on this product. Secondly, the investments that the other likely going to make are those that would explore to find new resources. The problem with this is that most resource economies have also done resource exploration in the past. This is just primarily because they want to expand their operations in the past already. What this would imply is that the land that they have available right now is likely already maximized. So this also applies to a lot of things like agriculture because you're constrained by how much arable land you have. So it's unlikely there would be more of these resources to be found in the future, especially because it's just very difficult to find it the more you do it, right? Because the more you don't find, it's just unlikely to understand what is left there that could give more input to you. What this proves is specifically that a lot of the investments they would do on OP is just economically futile because it's marginal benefits that they would get at best. Obviously, the debate is about the analysis on the trade-offs and the opportunity costs that are necessary to make those futile investments that they would suggest. The last thing that I want to discuss is on labor. An economy is better when more people are employed because there's more ability for them to consume goods and put more money into circulation. And that's why good economies are those that have low unemployment rates and high employment rates, right? The problem with resource economies is that the more the supply becomes limited, jobs disappear. We see this in the past in coal mining towns in the US, for instance, where if these certain coal mines would have run out of coal, entire towns surrounding the coal mine would have disappeared because there's no longer an economic incentive for them to live there, given that there are no jobs, there are no ability for them to live in that town, and that is why they move towards city centers, towards jobs that are more sustainable, such as manufacturing, 9 to 5s in the office, for instance, that are just more sustainable for you. So it is only in manufacturing that you're able to create an immense supply of an immense demand for labor, such that people would have more sustainable jobs in the future, because manufacturing itself is a very labor intensive process that would require a lot of inputs for you, especially if you're a new emerging industry, which is just good because this means that there's more jobs that are available for people, and that is why they're able to meet their economic needs far better. But this would also just mean that they have more ability to participate within the economy in the far future, where it is likely necessary for you to survive. One problem is clear that opposition has to address. You would run out of these resources. They need to explain what more investment they could make such that you could magically restore oil and minerals.
Thank you for that fine speech, Deputy Prime Minister. Now to close the opening half of this debate, let's have Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay. Assuming I'm audible. Okay. Haleigh, she, her. POI is only at the 5th. I won't take you any sooner than that. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The world continues to change and shift as conflicts arise, where international trading is unstable, supply chains are being disrupted, and conflicts rapidly shift the global stage. We think then that the call out that we're first going to flag is that opening clash doesn't debate in current context. This is uniquely why closing government will win over everyone. But first, a few responses. Let's respond to opening opposition's push that we do not have enough capital to do this, and that it's going to be environmentally unsustainable. We think that firstly, there is enough capital for you to be able to do. If you have enough capital to be able to do expansion, you also have enough capital to be able to do resource to be able to shift towards manufacturing. Why is this true? Because firstly, capital generation is through shared profit allocation. Secondly, you have state capital from taxes. And thirdly, you have an existing network of countries that need raw materials and need inputs. If you likely need something back from them, you're probably still going to get it. But secondly, on unsustainability, if it is true that it is going to be unstable on our side, it's probably going to be even worse on your side. Because why? The expansion means that you're likely going to be more pervasive and more environmentally degrading. For example, in agriculture, you have to harvest more and more and more. In fishing, you have to overfish, you have to deforest, you have to overmine and quarry a lot of areas to be able to expand the extraction of resources anyway. So even if you can reasonably do it, there's little incentive to prove that it's going to actually happen. Insofar as you need to be able to expand these resources, you need to be able to have to sell something, otherwise you're going to run out if you do not do this anyway. Let's move on to our setup, right? And we think this is the most important thing, and this is how we'll directly outweigh OG. Because OG fails to discuss how necessarily the shift even happens, how necessarily we end up shifting from resource extraction to manufacturing. And this is important for you to understand, because you need to know this to understand why in the first place this is going to be done well and why it's going to be sustainable. And this already directly responds to opening opposition. We think that the timeline of development, what it necessarily looks like on side CG, it probably looks like first, we have strategic budget allocation and strategic planning of development projects to avoid crashing. You have to assume that this operates in the median case where the policy will be done well. Otherwise, if we assume that all sides are going to be corrupt and all sides are going to be bad, this debate shouldn't happen anymore. The second thing is that likely we do have a stable amount of input from the primary sector. If it's like OG said, if it's able to capacitate an entire economy, we probably have enough resources to spare to be able to we probably have enough money to be able to spare to be able to fund this small thing. So meaning that we probably still have enough to export, and even if we take some money out, we're still going to be fine. The second thing is that we have a strategic transitory period where the shift of supply with regards to manufacturing jobs and products is going to slowly increase in order to create that organic demand. This directly responds to opening opposition's push on how there isn't necessarily going to be a demand for this in the first place, and how these jobs aren't going to be proximate to people. We think that this is probably likely to happen. You already see this happening in status quo. Like for example, when the United States shifted from manufacturing to be able to provide more service care providers in Cebu City and Manila, where the BPO industry slowly rose and established themselves as a forefront in the industry. And even in Cebu province with the Mitsubishi Corp, where they're shifting Cebu province from only producing natural resources to be able to manufacture electronic and mechanical components. That is to say that we think it's likely that the shift is going to be done well. It likely is going to be strategic, such so that we're not going to immediately crash like opening opposition says. This probably means then two things: that there's even more of a need for you to diversify the economy, not just simply because of OG's push that we're going to run out of resources, but no, rather it's because the places that we are relying on for manufacturing outputs are probably not going to be able to help us anymore. Because likely, right? Or even if that's not the case, you're likely to run out of buyers because buyers are going to shift to other places anyway. Why is this true? Because likely, you're probably not the only country who exports rich natural resources. We don't have a monopoly over the entire world. Or even at worst, your buyers leave because they don't want to be dependent anymore, i.e. US shifting away from away from natural resources in Africa because they'd rather be shifting to Venezuela and Latin America, where they can possibly claim Venezuela and say that that's their own, and therefore they're not dependent anymore. We think that secondly, because supply chains are already being rapidly disrupted in status quo, where we're literally having a fuel crisis right now in the Philippines because we do not have any other source of fuel, there needs to be less dependency on other countries' manufacturing sectors. It's dangerous when we have this kind of reliance in the event where these countries are in conflict, because then we aren't aren't able to survive anymore. This pushes then the further need for the diversification of the economy, where even at the where both on the point on where one, we're probably not going to be able to fully sustain ourselves insofar as natural resources are things that are going to run out. But secondly, with regards to output, because those are things that we need in status quo, we cannot always rely on other countries to manufacture these things for us. We need to be able to stand on our own 2 feet in the event that conflicts do happen. This already directly engages and disproves the existence of a safety net, as LO says there is, because how are you going to be safe when all of the products that you need to be able to survive aren't things that you can make in your own country anyway? I think then, two things already, right? That firstly, closing government is already able to sufficiently prove that the strategic budget allocation and the strategic timeline of where we shift to development is something that is likely to happen. And even then, there is a greater incentive for this to be done well on side CG, insofar as there are conflicts that do occur and there are conflicts that actively push you to want to be able to ensure that the shift from natural resources to be able to shift into manufacturing is something that is going to be done well, because you do not want to be dependent on other countries that are inevitably going to fall. This means two things then, that firstly, we already outweigh opening government, because you have to buy the prerequisite, you have to buy that the timeline is going to be done well, that their development is going to be shifted well. You have to buy this in order to be able to buy all of their impacts, insofar as they did not discuss this at all, they did not prove this at all. We already win over them. We already win over the entirety of opposition bench, insofar as there's one, no solvency to necessarily how they're going to be able to survive with regards to the natural resource depletion, and necessarily how they're probably going to be environmentally better off, because you need to be able to ensure that the environment that you live in is probably still going to be fine at the end of the day. We think it's probably less likely for that to happen on their side, insofar as the expansion is likely something that's going to be pervasive. Secondly, we sufficiently prove already that because the timeline shift is going to be strategic, it means then that there is balance, that manufacturing is probably going to be supplementary to resource extraction, and we're probably not likely to have all of the harmful pushes that uncharitably posits to us. So ultimately, at the end of the day, what do you get from CG? Firstly, the unique discussion on the timeline that proves is prerequisite and proves everything that you need to buy in order to buy from OG, so you have to give us the win. But secondly, we actually show you the problem that opposition has in status quo, that it's not about whether or not they're going to run out of resources, or it's not about whether or not they're going to not be able to set themselves up properly, but rather it's because they're probably going to run out of buyers, and probably because the environment degrades even worse on their side. For all of those reasons, propose CG.
Thank you for that fine speech, member for the government. Now to respond for the opposition, let's have member up for the opposition. Here.
Okay, sorry, let me get my timer real quick. We agree with all the other houses. Resources will run out at some point in the future. The question in this debate, though, is what is the point in which we can extend or maximize as much of those resources to have a longer lifespan than immediately transitioning to something as manufacturing, which until CO is still quite speculative, because it goes more than things just like budget and capacity. It goes down to the micro people's skills and the livelihoods they have. The first house I want to deal with is OG. They give two things. Firstly, they explain that the debate is about the future, that these are the next steps we're taking. We agree. One. But this requires you to believe, or OG's case largely requires you to believe, that all countries currently have this new sustainable technology for resource extraction, and therefore we've already reached the maximum development potential. Obviously, this is untrue because A, there's often a lack of demand for these sustainable practices to be taught anyways, especially if these are, regardless of whether these are economies of scale or third world countries, specifically because they rely so much on it, and oftentimes they want to extract it as, even if it's really unsustainable, as long as they can get profit off of it. We know that you could could only get the sustainable technology to lengthen the lifespan of these resources on our side, and it can only be fulfilled on our side when we use majority of export revenue to generate that demand and have the capacity. But secondly, what we're exclusively saying at CO is when you use or when you reinvest into the primary sector and you find ways to do this sustainably, you extend the longevity and lifespan of resources, and this is when you can build up the capital over time towards the future in the instance that you do shift. So the question isn't that will you lose resources more on their side or our side in the now. It is just a question of where you more certain you can garner the capital in the instance of shifting in the future when resources do run out. It is far safer when you do it with resource extraction, especially if you use majority of the revenue to find out ways to do it more sustainably and not drain all of it now. The second claim they have is they explain that there's a lot of room to enter in the supply chain. We would know two things. Often the competition stops you. There are often hostile tensions with other countries if you do try to insert yourself within these supply chains. Like obviously countries won't give in that easily to allow you to be able to take their position in that chain. But secondly, we would know that even if competition does not stop you, the issue with this is that when you enter the manufacturing industry and you're often against big companies with a lot of manufacturing technology, you have to lower prices significantly in order to compete with them. This means that this is often the room for exploitation to exist. So OO or opening gets the problem wrong. It's not that you have to expand or you have to raise the prices of goods in the first place. We think oftentimes you have to lower the prices of goods even if you have to bear more losses if you want to compete in the manufacturing sector with other countries. The third claim they have, but I'll be dealing with this with OO as well, is they explain that oftentimes what will happen or the problem is that you just don't have any more resources to extract, and this is necessarily bad, but I'll explain that later. I wanted to deal with OO because we'll just be a lot more charitable than OO, specifically because OO relies on two characterizations. Firstly, they rely on the fact that the government often lacks competence and is often very corrupt. And secondly, they rely on the fact that a lot of these manufacturing companies that are private are going to be very exploitative. We would agree with OG. They do give the right call out. If they assume that the government will be corrupt on either side, obviously then this debate wouldn't occur. Therefore, I think OO is largely out. But we're going to explain why A, even if the government was competent, why is this still bad? And B, even if these private companies or manufacturing companies were competent, why is it still bad as well? We know that even if the government had budget, there are two issues that neither op teams deal with. Firstly, it is necessarily the time lab. So obviously, if we're debating this in a timeline, you can't just take a fisherman and teach him how to be in a factory and doing this for hundreds or thousands of people without considering the hit it takes to your economy. The ability to train people, which is outside the question of resources and capacity, is something that takes a hit to the economy because you have to take people out of their current livelihoods now and slowly transition them. Meaning the productivity that you got in the primary sector will have to be reduced when you try to transition them to the manufacturing economy. If CG Web tries to explain that this is necessarily a willing trade-off, we will know that it is not, because you're not getting the best of neither sectors because you're trying to transition people from one sector to another, meaning that the months or the years it would take to make sure all of these people are fully equipped for the manufacturing economy is something that takes a big hit to your country. But secondly, we would note that even if you did not believe the time lag response, we know that a lot of people's skills in the primary sector are just not transferable in the first place, and it's very difficult to then teach them. This is why even if you had the capacity, this doesn't consider the externalities of the people involved. Secondly then, even if private companies were competent and did not exploit these primary sectors in the current country, why is this still bad? We would note it's specifically because when you, the developing country, are doing the manufacturing itself, you have to extract more and more resources because you have to do a trial and error process of how the manufacturing works. Oftentimes, the most efficient way to do manufacturing that's done by other countries is something you cannot copy, even if you have the capacity, often because it's kept exclusive to them. They don't want to share it because this is their competitive advantage, meaning you yourself have to come up with your own manufacturing process that's the most efficient. In the trial and error process of getting the most efficient process, you have to extract more and more resources to constantly correct yourself. And this responds to the CG extension as well, because the CG extension is that you cannot be dependent on other countries in order for their manufacturing process because supply chains may get cut. We would note that it's far worse if you rely on your own self, because that trial and error process that drains more and more of your resources into the manufacturing sector is what makes the country itself just more vulnerable to harm. This goes above O because we assume that these manufacturing companies are necessarily competent, but this goes above GOV as well because they don't realize that in order to get the benefits of the manufacturing sector you want, in the process that you are making up the manufacturing process, you have to extract so many of the resources that they very want to protect. To run is very simple. Why is reinvestment done well, and why does it have necessarily a good impact? Firstly, we would note it is on the safety and sustainability. So the issue with OO is they don't go beyond explaining sustainable technology. We would if they concede to the characterization that a lot of these countries are poor, we don't think it's going to be sustainable technology that always exists. We think it can just be things such as sustainable practices done by the people. And this is when you get majority of safety and sustainability measures for a lot of the people on the ground. Firstly, on people's skills. If it is true that people often have non-transferable skills, and often it is limited in the way they do these skills because they aren't that well informed, or people don't like they don't have as much investment. This is where you maximize their skills the most. But secondly, we will note that if you maximize their skills the most in the best way you can, this is actually how you get more sustainable ways to get these resources. So oftentimes the problem with status quo is the reason why resources are running out so quickly is because people are just not always informed as to how to do it well. This is why there's a lack of sustainability. That's how you correct it on our side. But secondly, we would note that it is also something for things such as cultural preservation. If it is true that a lot of these sectors necessarily rely on the people on the ground, and this is how they were often taught, this means integral part of the community in the first place. What this means is that these people that are at the core of this debate often need a justification in order for you to shift them to the manufacturing process. We would note that if you're able to improve and maximize their skills now, and at least widen their skills a bit more, that's how the transition to the manufacturing process in the instance in the far future is far better. Comparatively, if you just move them all of a sudden, not only you have to deal with the time lag within the economy, you also have to deal with people just being very angry and riled on the ground. But secondly, we will note that the investment is necessarily done well because this is how you keep external investors' trust. So the issue with government is if you tell investors to invest in your country that you're shifting to the manufacturing process, often there will be a rapid pullout, specifically because your competitive advantage isn't that much anymore. Comparatively, when you
Order.
look for a way to make it more sustainable, that's a point in which it just gets far better for them. For all these reasons and more, proud to propose things. Oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech, member of for the opposition. Now to wrap up the case of government, let's have government whip. Here, here.
Hello, assuming I'm audible. I don't have a socket that's close to me right now. So if ever I disconnect, my partner would be calling me. But hopefully not. I hopefully have enough energy. Okay. I'll accept POI when I can. Starting my speech. In 3, 2, and economies dependent on resource exports are highly affected of external problems. Transitions of these countries to more sustainable sources of economic input that can better withstand crash outs and issues it's further sustain the country's needs because it is not dependent to external actors in their stability. For anything else, responses then to both OO and CO. I think first, OO is wrong to debate on capacity. The motion literally points you have capital from profit. If it's too big, 30% of more is already enough. The OG never explained this. You only heard CG clarify a lot of the success of the transitions from other economies, but also the context is very important because of instabilities due to war threats and economic crash outs beyond the concern, but even the environmental degradation that was not even responded to by CO. O is also running on a negative case, so their sustainability is assumptive when trading is currently being threatened on several countries. Therefore, there's high risk with strained relationships that currently exist. But independently on CO, we in most of the answers on CO's push of human labor was explained by the timeline that the state will ensure fair balance of manufacture, but also build on human labor. Therefore, the demand will likely be organically put in. Both OO suffers because there's no proof of an expansion. We said how shifts can be productive, even OG lack this. So all of the teams suffer because they don't have positive material. US, China, India did this even in cities in the Philippines. You only have that demonstration from Haleigh. It's more risky for CO as well because they need to compete as well when you do a resource expansion. So there's also lowering their prices because they're likely going to demand for other or more countries to be able to trade with them. Also, MO was lying on trial and error. I think they won't waste resources because best practices is done, but the fact that these countries have experts like engineers who establish the resource extraction industry, I think that it's also possible to create the demand on manufacturing. That being said, why does our extension independently win the round then? Haleigh explains the timeline where the transition period will be done well. This is the mechanism that is prerequisite from the government and explains how it will happen more than the case of justifications. This is the prerequisite towards explaining all the long-term impacts of the team, responsive towards how opposition opposition posits success. So CG independently explained it. Let's weigh then. I think we're able to diversify sources of economy, which makes it more sustainable. We also anchor the necessity towards a self-sustaining economy due to other things that are impacting us, such as like the COVID-19 back in 2020 or the current war threats in the present. Countries like China, heavy on manufacturing, was able to survive better, but even neighboring countries like Taiwan. But in long term, we say that US suffered so much with cutting down on manufacturing back in the 90s. This is the common occurrence with countries that do not process their own goods because right now they're focused on the service and hospitality industry. Two questions I'm going to posit in this round. One, will countries be able to transition? But letter B, where do we create more sustainable economy? I think these two questions are very important because we clarify the mechanisms how countries allocate a portion of these profits, but we also look at the unique resources of the countries in the present. Assuming states are stable enough, I think we can build manufacturing in as much as they expand. I think this is the best median case, which opposition tried to demonize, but also they never explained how expansion happened. They all ought to lose. Assuming that happens now, we question the expansion because there's no mecon opposition that happens. So both opening doesn't demonstrate as well how either transition or expansion looks like. So OG is unfair to always say that resource runs out, or always also bad by saying that there's no money to build manufacturing. I think this is not a zero-sum game. It's about strategic allocation of resources. So let's weigh again. From Haleigh, we clarify that in the aspect of environmental consciousness, because our world faces climate crisis where reclamation is increasing, we say, and microplastic are also increasing in the environment, it's very important to be strategic and to shift. This is why we can be more responsive at all the external issues that is confronted by opposition side, because we talk about the immediate future. Again, the timeline is only clear from CG. We better explain our incentives and even have better solvency on all the problems we push to opposition. We also how then will countries then be able to transition? We say then that capital is generated, but we explain how does it cycle back to people and the state. This is very responsive towards CO's human skilled labor necessity. The problem with opposition is that they don't explain expansion, but we say we're done. We've already done this in the immediate past or in the present, like in the Cebu province, Zamboanga City with the sardine industry, and even both in Bangalore, India, and Pakistan with their manufacturing. But they also become assets towards their own resource extractions because it will work hand in hand with a newly built manufacturing. Again, this is not an offset. It is possible to have balances of these economies. You only heard that from CG. But OO should be penalized for a negative case that was pushed. Where is expansion? Because they will lose because there's no positive material on their side. Can I just say as well that instead of just mentioning the destruction that will deplete the resources, which CO also agrees, the extents will explain how dependence means that it's prone to abuse of power and abandonment from superpower nations like the US. I think the promotion of balance was only possible through CG's timeline because we look at supply and demand enough to break even or sustain the manufactured products. Again, there is enough demand and we will be able to supply those demand. And of course, we are not just gonna transition and create so much. We identify what to sell, where to sell, how much to sell. Again, we strategically look at demand and the partners that we currently have. Before further responses, yes.
Oo.
Go.
Okay. The problem with that is that we actually prove to you that OO has positive material, that we can expand sustainably. So how then can you prove to us that we don't necessarily have the positive material that came from DPM? DLO, sorry.
Mentioning that you have expansion doesn't mean you have mechanism. That is your problem, not mine. Haleigh was so important because the nature of these countries affected who are prone to climate change impacts but are easily disposable for superpower nations the moment they run out of resources. I think this dynamic is unique from CG because we explain how the transition happens and how we make the economy sustainable. To conclude on more sustainable economies, we look at contextual truth of the global south and how these countries would transition and be better for their own economies. I think just lastly on closing opposition, because a lot of their push is easily answerable. I think both opposition benches suffers and needs to answer their proof on expansion, because we said how shifts can rather be productive, such as in US, India, in the past that they've done this. I think that the far risk that creates upon them is the fact that they don't have backups the moment the economy crash outs or the moment that the external actors no longer want to trade with us. Very proud to propose. Thanks.
Thank you for that fine speech, Government Whip. Now to cap off this debate, let's have Opposition Whip. Here.
Hello. Checking if I'm audible. By the way, I'm gonna record my speech. If you guys want me to delete it after the round, though the round is I think being live streamed, let me know. Give me a moment. I'll just get my timer.
You're audible, and does anybody disagree with the speaker recording their speech? So I assume everybody's consenting, so you may now proceed.
Yeah. All right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason why closing. Wait. Sorry. Wait. Wait. I think something happened. Give me a second. Okay. Sorry. Hold on. Hello.
Yes, you're still audible.
Okay. All right. Sorry for that. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The reason why closing opposition is going to take this debate is because we're the only team in this round to actually explain why the process inherently of switching to this pivot economy of like having manufacturing goods in the now, even despite the timeline that CG wants to talk about, is inherently harmful, and why on our side you're far better off to create sustainability practices and actually help the workers on the ground. This is why we have to oppose. I'll do two things in this speech. Firstly, I just want to bring back and explain why the extension coming from Patrice is inherently important and round winning. The first thing that she talks about is why the reinvestment is likely to be done well. It's specifically going to be done well because what they're going to do on our side is that they're going to create sustainable practices insofar as that you're going to have the people that already have these non-transferable skills and you're going to teach them how to maximize these skills in the first place. As such, that is at the point at which you're going to be able to get the maximum sustainability, which is then when you're going to have greater capital to be able to manufacture in the first place. Note specifically that the prerequisite analysis to prove the opening opposition's claims comes from side CO. So as such, we have to rank over them. But secondly, we talk about non-transferable skills and how they can still be improved. And specifically why this is important is because it's the only time that you're able to cater to this specific actor group that has been relatively lost in the debate. Two reasons. Firstly, is that you're going to prolong the longevity of the resources in the first place. Insofar as that by creating sustainable practices, that is when you're going to be able to have the resources for a longer amount of time. Specifically, this is important because then that means that when you do shift to manufacturing, you can do it on a more stable ground. I want to note specifically for both government teams, when they talk about their timeline, it's still unsure as to how this is going to be sustainable, specifically when you're going to, number one, have to retrain these people to do these separate jobs, and number two, have to deal with the fact that you do not have enough capital because of the fact that you're running out, you don't have the necessary like industry to support you in terms of like the primary sector. Secondly, is that we explain that these people are going to be more agreeable to manufacturing in the first place. These workers on the ground who've already maximized their craft. Why? Because they will see it as the logical next step forward. This is important because when you have that agreement that manufacturing is the next best thing, that is when you do not have strikes. That is when you do not have union laborers to protest against it. That is specifically when your country and your economy is far better off under our side. The next thing I want to do in this speech is specifically go team by team and explain why we have to win this debate. Firstly, I want to deal with closing government. Their main push is that it's dangerous to depend on a manufacturing country when they will eventually fall economically and politically. And this is the main attack that they launch. And the response here is quite simple. It is the fact that this case works on a rare basis. It is the fact that for the majority of the amount of time, you're not going to fall into an economic recession. You're not going to just randomly start World War III. It's specifically important because we believe that closing government's case only works in a rare instance of cases. And even if this does happen, it is a rare instance of cases which will not necessarily affect the country in the long term. Even if you are technically dependent on these countries, we specifically explain that even with their like strategic transition period, the process is inherently harmful because you do not have the capital to do this in the first place. And even then, their comparative does not account for the transferable skills of the people that Patrice mentions. No engagement comes from closing government regarding this. This is specifically important because what we explain is that on our side, you're far able to cater to the people, you're far better able to cater to the people, but also to just maximize the skills of what they can provide to the economy. Insofar as you can't necessarily just switch. That is like the process of switching is far worse under government teams when they're going to have to take that economic loss, whereas we are able to do it more like over a long period where you can treat these workers better, make them learn better, and do it sustainably. I'll take the point. Go.
Does a country that specializes in fishery only teach fishery in school?
No, that's not the point. I feel like the point is that a country specialized in fishery has a lot of people that are good at fishery. As such, it is what they have specialized in. It is their main trade. Specifically, this is important. Sure, they know how to do other things, but we think that if this is your main trade, it's what you're going to be the most specialized in. As such, for you to the time that it would take en masse to teach everybody the new set of skills that they already learned from school is far too long. We think that this uncertainty is what makes government teams lose this debate. The next theme that I'm going to deal with is opening opposition. Now, I really want to just quickly call out how uncharitable they're being, right? I agree with all of the other teams in this debate. Specifically, that you cannot just debate a motion about, is it feasible or is it not? Because if we didn't have that, then there wouldn't be a debate in the first place. Specifically, the claim that comes from them is that these economies cannot just feasibly handle the shift to production, that there's not going to be enough people to like do this, or that you're lacking machinery. Now, the problem here, as I already mentioned, is that it is very, very uncharitable. But even if you want to like bite into this, closing opposition is the only team in this debate that's able to explain the process, and as such, we immediately have to rank over opposition regarding this because we explain the inherent non-transferable skills of people, and we actually explain the sustainability practice that deputy mentions. For these reasons, we have to rank over opening opposition just on the way that we debate this motion, and we actually provide the characterizations and analysis that would get them all of their benefits. Thirdly, I just want to really quickly like deal with opening government, because what do they explain? They have like two attacks. Firstly, is that you've already maximized the primary sector already, and that you are dependent on it. That once you run out of resources, your economy will fall, and this is their main attack. So if we can defeat this, we've already beaten opening government. And I have two responses to this. The first is that the comparative is far worse when you specifically worsen trade relations with other countries, and you just have to try. You have to like make your manufacturing goods less expensive just so that people can buy it. If Taiwan is already selling a lot of semiconductors and you're trying to do the same thing, obviously people are still going to buy from Taiwan unless you make your stuff cheaper. Specifically, this is harmful because that is the trade-off that we'll have to take in the long term, and it's just very unclear what the solvency is on their side. But the second response is that Patrice already explains that the process of reinvesting in the primary sectors will not just create new resource, or it's going to create sustainable practices that, number one, have the workers on the ground maximize their skills and make them have better practices, and two, you prolong the longevity of already existing resources. In the long term, we mitigate the negative economic harms when you do it so suddenly, like on both government teams, because we take longer on CO, and in the process, we train people to do these other things, and we train them to maximize their skills. The second attack that comes from opening government, and this is also kind of what closing government talks about, is like how the manufacturing is going to, you're going to need like the primary sector for manufacturing in the first place. That it's the prerequisite of getting manufacturing in the first place. This deals with both government teams. So if I respond to this, we have to win it over them. Now, the response here is quite simple, and Patricia already points this out. It's the fact that manufacturing is a trial and error process. The response that comes from Adi is just that like, we're obviously not gonna waste resources, right? So obviously we're going to do it well. We think that's a little odd because countries mentions, and this isn't engaged by, obviously, your country does not know the peak manufacturing style. Other countries have their own manufacturing setups. They have their own machineries. This is important because that means that in the process of doing that trial and error to create that manufacturing in the first place, you will lose out on materials. And that's specifically important because when you lose out on materials, you lose out on the main benefit that government teams are trying to give you in this debate. For all these reasons, CO has to advance.
Thank you for that fine speech, Opposition Whip. You may now cross houses. For my fellow adjudicators, can we go to the deliberations, please?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the round.
Thanks, bro.